So I've gone ahead and drawn a bit more information based on what we already had discovered here. And I took this image that's here and I drew a couple of more elements. So this is a ridge beam, and we'll be labeling all this. This is a ridge beam, and the ridge beam is typically 2 inches bigger than the actual rafters. And the rafters come in at an angle, and they have to be bigger because it's an angular cut. They've got to support a larger surface area. And same with these. These are hips. Now what I show here is the ceiling rafter, which is one of these. And what I've done is, like I said, I've gone ahead and drawn this. This is the ceiling rafter or the roof rafter. The ceiling joists, again, ceiling joists have some sort of finish on the underside of them. So I'm going to be calling these rafters here just so that you're familiar with the terminology, and we'll be looking at a bit more of that later on. But the rafter itself is the 2x6s that we had selected for this application. But where they meet at an angle or at the top, they need to change dimensions to a 2x8. See, these rafters are coming in at an angle onto a board which is also on an angle. So this angle is meeting another angle, and therefore these pieces here have to be larger. So this is the ridge beam or the ridge rafter, and it will be a 2x8. These are hip rafters, and they will also be 2x8s, whereas the joists or the roof rafters will all be 2x6s. And you can see how these two elements actually also rest on the post, and that's what gives it its strength. So there's a bit of triangulation here between the ridges and the joists or the rafters, and this triangulation is what gives it its support. So I've drawn this out here so you can see how the framing elements will come together. And then what I did was I copied this picture up above, the drawing itself, and I've used a couple of different line types in order to be able to show the actual posts and the beams. And what we're going to do is now we're going to place this all in a drawing. The information here, when you're looking at this, this is an elevation, so these two must be stretched out. And anything below this grade line, now I'm not including anything like decking material or in the case of pavers or anything like that. So anything below this line will be a hidden line type. And you can't see it here. This is in model space. But if I click on it, you'll see up in here in the ribbon, it's a hidden line type because it is an elevation. I don't need this line anymore, so I'll get rid of it. However, this is going to be a section. So a section cuts through the element, and therefore the grass line or the grade line is going to be cut here. And all of these lines here are continuous or solid. Remember, sections we draw all solids. In elevations we'll draw this type of line, which is a hidden line type below grade. So what about this one that I drew in the middle? Okay, a couple things I have to change. So the height of this is incorrect because it was based on a line that we had earlier. So I'm going to move this line here to the correct line height, where here I've added an offset height to it, so it shows the 1-inch offset, and that's the height or the true height of that line. And anytime I extend a line like this, I have my F8 on. That gives me a nice horizontal vertical line, and I will use stretch. You can see how often I use stretch to correct things. It's a very, very useful command. You just got to know how to use that command properly. Now I've got those at the right height, and I can delete that line. And I'm going to take all this information and copy it because it's correct. So I will copy that from where? The base point here. So that's where this line meets that offset. Okay, that's where I want it. And I'll pick on that and that. And I'll also stretch these two lines over. So my two views are the same. The only difference between the two views is one's going to show the flat side or the longer side, and the other one's going to show the short side. Now, a lot of this construction line, I don't want to show up in my viewport. So I'm going to take all that. Remember, I created that all in the Gazebo layer and just changed its colors. Now I'm actually going to change its properties to construction. So when I view it in the viewport, all I need to do is turn that layer off, and it's fine. I've copied this above, So when we're looking at information we have to give the builder, what do they need to know? Okay, let's switch to the dimension layer. I'm going to be using a 1/4 inch scale only because I've already gone into there and I know exactly what scale. I don't have a 1/4 inch scale here, so I got to create one. So what I'm going to do in here is go into my layer property and find one of the dimension layers that are already there. There we go, dim 12. And I'm going to create a new one. Now I selected that one, so when I create a new one, it takes on all the properties of it. See, it's the same red color and everything else here. And this is going to be dim 48. Every time I use a new dimensional layer, I've also got to use or create a new dimension style. So now that I've got that, I'm going to make that active. Close this down. And then in annotations, I'm using land 144 right now, but I need to create a new one. So I'm going to take on the properties of what I already have, which I know is correct, the land 32, and I'm going to create a new one based on that. So it's copy of land 32. No, we're going to call this one land 48 because it is at a 1/4 inch scale that I'm going to be drawing this at, land 48. So this is the only number I got to change in the Fit tab, 48. Select OK and close it. So what do you think is critical here? Well, the first thing that's critical is the placement of the posts. So I'm going to select linear and I'm going to go to the midpoint, and that's what we want to do is find the exact center of that post to where? Well, to the midpoint. And that needs to be my 12-foot distance. Where am I placing the dimensions? Well, when I look at my layout, I got to determine where I'm going to label and where I'm going to dimension. And this will help me lay out that page. This is the first page. So if I'm making my notes on the left side, I want to have my dimensions on the right. If I'm making my notes on the right side, I want my dimensions on the left. I know right now I don't want it on this side. Now, why did I do it there? Just so that I could show you that there is a difference between picking and we just don't arbitrarily choose. So I'm going to go mid between 2 points. And here, mid between 2 points. And these lines, anything to do with the actual configuration of the support posts, you'll notice that they're hidden and they're gray. They're going to show up very lightly because the roof is the dominant feature here. Okay, from there, what do I want to do? I want to continue that dimension. So dimension, continue. And what's that going to show from the center to here? That's the roof overhang. Now, it's a bit of an odd size, and that's okay. Remember, I had options to select the size of it, and I'm going to do again here. So dimension, and I want to do a continue dimension. Now it's going to continue from the other end, so I type in S and enter for select, and this is all review. There's my overhang. What's the other important dimension? Well, in order to help with some of the calculations, you should have an overall. So I'm going to pick linear, and I can click on the two sides here from dimension to dimension and place it there. That's the side of it. Or what I can also do is this. So I can go into dimension, baseline, type in S and enter for select. And now I'm going to pick this extension line, the bottom one. And it automatically sets that to the right offset height. So it's a trick that we use just to make sure that everything looks perfectly laid out. Okay, so that's that dimension. What else do I need to dimension? The posts from above, linear, mid between 2 points, and mid between 2 points. There's my horizontal dimension. And now I'm going to continue that. That one's pretty simple to do. I'm going to continue that. I'm just using my enter key. Dimension, continue. From here. Good. And I will do the baseline dimension, use the S function for select that line to that point. There's my overall. So that's the roof overall, and that typically helps the builder identify through calculations the amount of shingles that they need, the plywood sheet size, things of that nature. Okay, what else do I need dimensionally on this drawing? Nothing. Nothing else is required. What's critical here is where the posts are laid out. Once the posts are there, you really don't have a choice in adjusting anything else. So those dimensions are consistent throughout your project. Whenever you're dimensioning something that's involved with the posts, you got to match the dimensions that are above there. So in here, what are the critical dimensions that we're going to use? Well, we need to know these heights. So I've got a footing, and I'm going to place it just about here so I have a bit of a decent extension line. If I go out too far, see how that extension line just has a massive gap. So somewhere around here is good, and then I'm going to just use continue. So what are the critical dimensions here? We do the details first, and then we get into the overalls that would help the builder. So dimension continue. So the details are, for instance, in here, what is the actual sonotube height? I've got just a little over 4 feet. Let's just see there. 4 1/16. I'm going to adjust all that because I really don't need that. And then at the top of it, what do I have there? 2-inch gap there. Good. That's a good dimension. And the fascia board and the overall height. Okay, and then what are the critical dimensions from top to bottom? Well, this 1/16 of an inch is a useless dimension. It should only be 4 feet. So what I'm going to do here, all at once, modify, stretch. I'm including all of the footings right across the drawing that I have here. That's all I need. So right-click, click anywhere, and then type in at 1/16 inch less than 90. And I did something wrong. I'm not too sure what. It could be the accuracy of the drawing. Where I copied and pasted that drawing information. So what's happening in here is it's not true to its size. So how do we resolve this? What's the easiest way? Here, I'm going to show you a little trick. So I'm going to draw a continuous line right along here. That's where my measurement comes from. Good. And now, see, there's my construction line, and I'm going to offset that construction line exactly 4 feet. By doing it this way, I know I'm to 16 decimal place accuracy. So this is not quite a 1/16 of an inch, and that's why we're getting that anomaly. Now, you may say I'm getting really picky. You're absolutely right. So here, I'm going to stretch this. So stretch, same thing, that to this. Only this time, I'm going to be using this gauge. So let me pick 2 points where it crosses. There we go. I want to stretch it from here to there. And now I should get exactly 4 feet, which I do. Okay? So there are ways of getting it exact. If I type it in and I'm not getting the right numbers, I'll just change them by doing it that way. So what are the next critical dimensions? Okay. So I want to make sure that the builder knows that the post is so many feet below grade. So dimension. And baseline, we're going to select S and enter that. And this is where I'm going to hit that grade line. Now, the grade line is slightly different from the offset. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick this as my grade line for now. This is the post. And then I'm going to move the grade down just to make sure I've got that dimension. Why is this critical? Well, let me show you here. Let me move all this. And it's not a single line. It's right across here and here and here. Why is that so critical? Well, there's an easy explanation why. And that explanation is simply to make sure that we have the correct distances above and below the posts and the finished grade. They need to know exactly how deep to make this so that the footing is at the right height level. And we always use the, in our location, it's got to be at least 4 feet below grade. So I don't include the depth of the footing when I calculate my 4 feet, just in case, you know, we get a long, cold, hard winter that doesn't have a lot of snow. That 4 feet may actually be slightly exceeded, and that's what I want to make sure it doesn't get exceeded. So what's the next critical dimension? Well, actually, the next critical dimension will appear here. Where is that beam height relative to the post? But we can't see it here. So the following dimensions here will simply identify the elements. Now, for the most part, it's already shown here, so all I need is an overall height. So dimension, continue. I will be picking up most of that other information when I actually go and dimension the section. So there's my overall height. I've got it to a 1/16 of an inch. It may be a bit silly doing that. I can change this to an 1/8 of an inch, which probably would be more appropriate. So I'm going to go into annotations, and I'm using the land 48. So let's go and modify this. Land 48. Modify, because it's not new. And if I go into primary units, see how it says a 1/16 of an inch? Let's change that to an 1/8. Even an 1/8 is a bit odd for this size, but I'm going to leave it at an 1/8. I like to go one more and see what it's done is change this to 1/4 and 3/8 and 5/8. Those are more reasonable dimensions for a project of this nature. So what other critical dimensions should I have in here? I'm going to include some down here so that when they're looking at the footing, they get a good sense of where it is and how big it is. And there's a couple things that are interesting in here because we're going to dimension eventually the sonotube, but all the dimensions, the critical ones, should be from center lines of posts. And I can do that before or I can do that after. Let's see how it looks. So I'm going to continue dimensions, and this will give me the sonotube thickness, the distance between footings. Is this all important? Absolutely. So they can easily double check the dimensions between these, the formwork that they're going to be putting into the ground. And that's really useful. What else would be useful in this case? I'm going to pick baseline and S and enter. This one, the overall. So they know exactly where to dig the hole and how big that hole is. Now what's not shown in here is one of the most critical dimensions, which is what? The spacing, the center lines of the actual columns themselves. I've got a couple of choices, and I may adjust that after I see it on the actual site plan or the plan layout. But for now, I want to do the center line of these posts. Okay. A critical dimension that we should always include, or a critical label that we should also always include, is a line that shows from the midpoint of this post. So I'm going to pick mid between 2 points, straight down. Okay. And I'm going to change the property of this to reflect it being a center line. Let me copy that from there. Make sure I'm always hitting the exact middle of those posts. So that's a critical dimension. And I can either decide to trim this dimension off so it doesn't interfere with a number, or leave a gap in another way, or dimension it internally to make sure those center lines are clearly shown. It all depends on how much room I have in the drawing and how I'm going to define my notes. So for here, if I go to dimension in here, see what it does? Extend outwards, but that's a critical post dimension. Let's see how some of this stuff actually looks. So what I did was I created a new drawing template just by using the copy command. So you can go into any of these tabs below, right-click on it, select move or copy, and then click on any one of your tabs. And, oh, it's moved off of my screen. There we go. Click on any one of the tabs and create a copy. I've already done that. And I've cleared all the data onto the sides of the drawing here and here. And now I'm going to make some viewports to see my drawing. So I selected my viewport layer. I clicked on View Viewports. I'm just going to do one, because I can always copy and paste them and just put one anywhere. I immediately see the whole drawing. And when I look at inside of here, I'll double click inside of here. When I look inside of here, this is the project I'm looking at. Look, things have disappeared. Why? Because I copied some other L drawing, and it had that particular layer off. So I'm going to make sure I have the right layers on and off. This, in this particular case, is the gazebo. So I'm inside the viewport, by the way. I'm going to make sure that this thaw is on for the gazebo inside that viewport, and I want to turn off the construction lights. I don't need the construction lights. So in the viewport, construction, I'm going to turn that off. Notice I'm using the square freeze on and off or thaw as opposed to the light bulb so I don't turn it off everywhere. Okay, this is what we have. I'm going to begin by double-clicking inside just to make sure I'm in the viewport and centering that roof as best I can. I'm going to try quarter-inch scale. So Z enter 1/48 XP. And that fits nicely in there. And this is the drawing that we want to start with. Well, where did all my dimensions go? I had dimensioned this down below. Did I not dimension the roof? Absolutely. So it's obviously off as well. So I'm going to go up in here. There's my 1/48. Turn that on. There are my dimensions. So you can see how easily I can read that. It's nice and clear. I'm going to move the drawing so it's nicely up in this edge here. That looks perfect. And I'm going to shorten my viewport here in those directions. There we go. And everything seems to look perfect. I may have to move this here so it's tighter up into that corner. I forgot to take my F8 off, so give me only horizontal and vertical. Okay, that's good. What about down below? So here's a little trick. When we drew this immediately below each other. Okay, how do I make my drawing look perfectly aligned? Well, if I copy the viewport, and I'll copy it straight down. Let me try that again. Copy the viewport, and I'll copy it straight down. Okay, there's the roof again, but if I double-click inside this viewport, hold down the wheel and then the Shift key, it immediately moves things in a perfectly horizontal or vertical manner. There we go. I want to get all that footing and information in there. Now you can see some interference between the two drawings. So my dimensions can't go that low. That's the problem with this. And up in here, that viewport, my dimensions can't go that high. I can't lay this out exactly the way I wanted to because of the fact that the drawing has all this detail in it. So what can I do? Well, I'm going to cheat a bit here rather than show the whole view because the dimensions are more critical than the view. There we go. I'm going to change where that 8-foot location is. I'm going to go right down to the bottom here. And if I take this view here and I shorten it, good. And then I'm going to copy that view here and double-click inside of it and now move downwards. So what I've done is I've truncated my line work. I'm going to make sure certain critical dimensions are in there. That 14-foot is a critical one. Am I missing anything else? Yeah, there's one that's in here that I'm going to have to change or modify. But you can see what the problem is here is the fact that my drawing is too big for the area. So that's one way of clicking on too many things here at once. That's one way of doing it. I can truncate those lines by creating 2 viewports and showing it. What about turning the drawing in a different direction or a different dimension? So that may be a better solution here. Okay, I'm going to change all of this, so I'm just doing Control-Z. And as I do Control-Z, I'm getting rid of everything. I want this in the opposite direction. This isn't working for me. It's just not being able to lay this project out properly. So I'm going to double-click inside of here, type in UCS. And I want to rotate that around the Z-axis. And I want to rotate it 90 degrees. And you can watch the UCS icon, the X and Y. See it rotated 90 degrees? Now I type in plan. And if I do this in this manner, I think I should be able to fit the drawing in a bit better. There's my drawing. So let's try this. I this a bit bigger. I can switch my dimensions afterwards. I'll double click in here, make sure I got the right scale. Z enter 1/48 XP. Now, I always like to type it in just to make sure. I can always check that, whether I did that right, because it will appear down here. Now, you can, in fact, click and change your values right in here. I just like to do it that way because it reminds me that I need to use those values elsewhere. I'm going to flip these dimensions. I don't like where they are. Now, this is tricky. I'm in the viewport. I'm going to mirror this. Where? Midpoint to midpoint. Let's see if this works out. Okay. It looks like it worked. It didn't. Our dimensions, when we dimension it in our style, these numbers cannot appear below the horizontal or the vertical line, the dimension line. They have to appear above them. We can't use this technique. Okay, what does that mean in effect? Well, if I go back to model space, I've got to change how I'm looking at that picture to make sure it's dimensioned correctly. Now, this particular element in here, you can see the way it's rotated around here. It's not going to work unless I dimension a rotated view of it. It all depends on how things are actually aligned or laid out. So the easiest thing I can do is I'm going to take some of these construction lines. I'm going to move them to the edges of this. And again, they're just construction lines, so I can move them at any time. Extend that up. Extend that up. Take this image and rotate it. And now that I've rotated it, I can move it. And I know it's a bit of a pain, but this is sometimes what we need to do in order to make sure that we are following all of the different requirements for dimensioning. You'll notice that some of this may have already changed. I think it did. Let's see if I can mirror this information now from the midpoint. And see, the dimensions have changed. They're now in the right location. However, what I did was I now messed up my L7, because if I go here, the actual image is no longer there. Okay, it's in the wrong direction. So UCS, let's do that again, UCS, Z, enter. I want to rotate it back, so negative 90 degrees. And plan. And now I got to find this drawing that I just did. There it is. So I'm back to where I was before. Z, enter. 1/48 XP. Now, why did I go through this convoluted way of doing all this? I'm anticipating that some of you are going to run into some problems when you're creating this image. So I'm trying to resolve some challenges that you may have as you're working through this project, and that could be one of them. So now that I've got this, now remember what I did and how I moved it and why I moved it. Look where I placed it, right below the elevation. I'm going to take these dimensions here, because I need both elevations anyways. These are all repeats. And I'm going to move them from that footing position to this footing position. Now, watch this. I'm going to stretch the dimensions. So stretch this. Now, type in R and enter and remove the center line because it may not work properly. And I'm going to stretch it from where? You're going to pick up that point right there, which is actually a node. Now you're going to stretch it to that. Notice these dimensions automatically modified. That's what we want. Now I can move that. And you can basically pick any point, or if you want to verify its position, you know what, I'm just going to pick any point here. Let's pick the nearest along there. And I'm going to move it to the midpoint between there and there. So I used all the data that was already drawn, and I simply moved it over. Now I'm going to go back to my viewport here, and I can copy this viewport. Let's see if this is going to work. It may not. We may have to do further adjustments. There's this viewport. Double click inside the viewport. Hold the wheel down, press Shift. Move your imagery up. There is the gazebo in that position. Now, let's see if it actually fits. I'm going to lengthen this window. Down pretty close to the bottom. Almost. Well, can I make any adjustments? I sure can. I'm going to move these two. Right to the top. I'm going to turn these layers off so we're not going to see them. I'm going to double click inside here and move this dimension right to the top. Now I want just enough room that when it prints, that line doesn't interfere with that. Okay. I'm going to look here. I'm going to stretch the window. Now these windows could overlap. I can easily take this window and overlap it. That's not a problem. Let me do that just to show you some alternatives here. And now I can double click in here, hold down Shift, hold down the wheel, move that up. Right there. Okay, let's see. Am I getting close? I'm getting closer. Let's see if I can get that 15-foot mark in. Go perpendicular down here. Almost. It almost works out perfectly. I can fiddle around with the dimensions, get them tied together, make sure that that offset distance isn't as big as what it is. Same with this one down here, and I'll make this work. Now these two lines here, the center lines, they should go all the way through. So let's make that adjustment now. Those two center lines here that I made should go all the way through and above. So I'm going to move this. Those are the two. How far? Just pick a point nearest. And make sure your F8 is on, and then pick another point nearest here. There. So when I adjust it there, it shows up in here. And those two have to align. That shows very clearly the post alignment. Now this gap in here, it could be an annotation issue. So let's go into our annotations. I've clicked on my L48, make sure that's selected, select modify. So it's the offset distance between dimensions. Let's see where that is. So we've got baseline spacing 3/8 of an inch. That baseline spacing is what's given us our challenge. So rather than 3/8, which is 6/16, I'm going to go with 5/16, see if that's going to make a difference. 5/16 of an inch. Okay, close this up and regen. Didn't seem to make a difference. Now, I wonder if I have to reselect all this and make sure it's meeting the right annotation. Either that or it's just not enough of a difference between that. That's still showing up as 3/8 of an inch. It may not allow me to do that in this way. I may have to redimension things to make sure that they fit properly, or I can just manually do that. So I'm going to do that manually. Modify stretch. Take all those dimensions, move them closer. Okay, the other side was okay. This dimension was a problem. The 15-foot. And I'm going to make that adjustment to see if that will fit. So a lot of fiddling. But you know what? It'll work. There we go. Let's move this up. It'll work. The only thing I'm having spatial issues with is actually where I'm going to put my title blocks. And my title block should be something that is below each element. If I can't fit them in properly, I could move them either to the left or the right. I'm going to have my notes on the right side. So I'm going to move those two over, and that will allow me to fit my title block information here and my title block information here. This is, well, I've got it as L7. It could be whatever L is on your drawing, and this will be a gazebo. I'm not going to identify east elevation or west. I'm just going to be gazebo long. Oh, I have my capital Gazebo. Long elevation period. I should use a G instead. And my scale is not 3/8, but it's a 1/4 inch. And let's see how that fits. Let's move this into its location. Let me take my shift off. And I still have interference with that drawing. This is going to be a bit of a challenge here. Maybe I have to move my notes onto the left side. Let's just see how this works. Now, you do have an option of actually reducing your scale of your drawing. I like a 1/4 inch scale for elevations just because it makes sense. If you do anything smaller than that, it may be difficult to read. Now, remember, the viewport layer will eventually come off. Yep, turn the current layer off. And that's what I'm going to have. Not too bad. So what about the rest of the space that I have here? Okay, I turn my viewport layers back on. I'm just testing it along the way. I want to draw my section in here. My section has a lot of details, and this is where the section came from. This drawing here, where we duplicated it. I go back to model space. We duplicated this over here. So that's all in alignment here. So I want to draw a section, but let's see how well it fits first. So I'm going to copy this viewport over here. I'm going to turn off my shift. There we go. And the section should be the full height of this because we need to show all the detail. So I'm going to go right down to the bottom of this thing and right up to the top. And the section is drawn, holding down my wheel, holding down shift. Oh, I have to be inside of it. So I'm going to double click inside of this, hold down my wheel, hold down shift. There's my section. So that section needs to be quite a bit bigger. So this time I'm going to play with my values down here that actually allow me to jump to different values. So 3/8 of an inch, what does that look like? It could be my section. What if I go a bit bigger than 3/8? 1/2 inch. See, that one's really good. That gives me a lot of detail. Do I need the stuff up there? No. But this is pretty good right there. So this is going to be a 1/2 inch scale. And this tells me exactly how much information I can put in. And more importantly, it tells me when I go to dimension it, what dimension values I should be using. So I'm going to leave this out here. And I will go back into my model space. That's where it is here. I'm going to copy that line only. So it's from, let's just put it from there, perpendicular. Where that's the center line. It's an important one. Okay. And now I'm going to dimension it. But it's got a different scale, remember that. So how am I going to adapt that? Well, I'm just going to change this. I'm going to change 01 to 24. Now, hopefully I did it right. Again, trying to think 10 steps ahead sometimes slows me completely down. Yes, all of this information is about half that size. That's really what I need. So I will then go into dimension, continue, and remember that should be at a 4-foot height. Yep, and there's that offset post. Do I want to dimension that in here? That's actually a critical height. It's the height of the post. So I'm going to click there. This will give me my 1-inch offset. There we go. And I can move that dimension later on. This is the height of the beam. So the height of that beam is 8 3/8 of an inch. I can dimension the actual beam, which is 11 1/4. And then from there, I can give it the overall height here. So those are all critical dimensions. Now, that refers to the beam and the interior stuff. Notice how it's going to interfere with the fascia board. If I start dimensioning out here, I'm going to get some real ugliness. So that dimension in here, this one that I have 8 3/8, may be something that I should sneak in on the inside here. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to click on that point here. and then click on the inside and show that there. That makes a bit more sense to do. And that shows from the top of that offset, because we're using that offset unit, and I will show it to grade just so the builder knows exactly what I'm referring to. So I'm just using linear this time instead of settings, and there's my grade dimension. It's 3 3/16. Once again, getting into a 1/16 of an inch. It's my annotation value, so I'm going to go into my annotations. That's way too small, so I'll modify that. And in primary units, I'm going to change that rather than a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch. Let's see if that made a difference here. There we go, 3 1/4. Good. And from there, there's my beam height. That's a critical dimension. I'm also going to switch this dimension here so that it will come into the inside of this. There's my beam height. That's more important that I have that done correctly. Now this, I can go back to the fascia board height, and this will also go to the fascia board height. Now I need to sneak in another dimension there. Notice how they're sharing nodes. That's a problem. So what I've got to do is when I select one, I'm going to switch this all over to the inside here. Now they're not sharing nodes, and therefore I can adjust the dimensions separately. So let's put in a linear dimension from here to here and line it up with there. That shows the fascia board height. Now the overall height we've got somewhere else. So if it doesn't fit, let's take a look at what we created here. L7. It doesn't quite fit. What's more important? Well, if I move this down, I could put that in, but then I missed the bottom of my footing. So I can do it that way. What about this information in the middle? I don't need all of it. So this is where it makes a bit more sense to truncate this overall height. I'm going to move that down to about there. And I'm going to copy this from there to there. I'm going to lower this viewport. And then I double click inside, hold down the wheel, and then shift. And bring this down. And I'm going to bring it down until I get my overall height. That's good. Excellent. So I've got two different viewports I'm going to be working in. Now, for the purposes of identifying that you've separated these two viewports should not be touching. So I'm going to take this viewport and move it down nearest approximately here. So there's actually a gap, and we're going to draw a symbol to represent that gap. That dimension is clear to me. It's done very well. What's important in here are things like this anchor bolt. So I'm going to dimension from inside of here. Now, some of you may say, well, that's kind of risky. Yeah, I've done this once or twice before. There's that dimension, and then I'll continue it to the top, and that shows that there's 2-inch clearance, and there's my 8-inch from the ground. So you can clearly see from here that that anchor bolt is 2 feet long. I can do a secondary dimension, or I can just label it. You can clearly see here that that footing is 10 inches wide, and I can dimension this overall. It's a 3-foot footing. Now, should I dimension to the center line? Well, if it was a weird number, it makes more sense. This doesn't make sense to be dimensioning that. Or what I can do is dimension above, so everybody knows, and they can see very clearly here, that this is my 10-inch projection, and around the projections, and the thickness should always be the same. Otherwise, it's an inefficient dimension, or inefficient footing, sorry. I could go to the center line here to identify that, or I can go here to identify the thickness. I think the thickness of that may be a bit more important than this detail, because we've outlined that other information somewhere else. And that's probably all the information or dimensional information I need there. Now, before I move to another part of this drawing, double-click outside the viewport. So what double-clicking does, and I have to press escape because I was in the middle of the command. What double-clicking does is it allows me to go to paper space. And in paper space, I'm not affecting the viewport. So there are my dimensions here. What else do I need internally here, which would be a good one? Yes, my overhang. So there's a couple of dimensions that could be really good to have in this location for the builder. So linear. This I know is a 1-inch offset. This is a 1-inch offset. Those are all numbers I could include in here or in my notes. Usually the builder will decide. Now, if I'm doing any kind of internal framing or putting some sort of finish, I may want to actually dimension that. But what is important is this overhang. And where's the overhang from? The builder needs to know where to cut this. And he needs to know where to cut it from the edge of the actual joist of the rafter to the side of the post. That's my overhang dimension that's critical here. Okay. Now, we can also provide one to the center of the post. I've already got that information somewhere else. So this overhang is clear to the builder that when you come off this post 11¼ inches, that's where you're going to apply the fascia board. And that's really what's important when it comes to the dimensional value. The other one I could include in here is this offset distance to make sure that the builder knows how far to go down. It's not as important because if he's done everything else correct, then it is correct just as it stands. And I'll make some notes about making sure that things are centered and anything of that nature. That's really what's important. All of this information now, you can see I've got it all dimensioned. I can move this because I want to have lots of room for my text. I want to move this so that I still see all the dimensions. It's a bit too far. Now I click on Move and P and Enter for previous. Move that in just a touch. Yeah, that looks good. And now I can take these 2 points and I'm going to move them in. Because they're viewports, I don't have to use stretch or anything. I can click on one point. It automatically squares the viewport point out. There we go. And there is my sectional drawing. This is at a 1/2 inch scale, so it makes a bit more sense to get all these dimensions in and all the details. And this is a detail of all of this stuff that's here. There's certain bits and pieces in here that have to make sense to the builder that they are the same numbers. I don't have a lot of that information duplicated. I've got the overall roof height, 5'5" and 1/8, 5'5" and 5/8. So I've got to make sure that I'm pointing that dimension to the right location. 5.5 inch fascia, that's good. This has 8¼ inches. This has 7 and 11. Why? Because of the 2 inch and the 1 inch offset detail. So I may want to include some of these dimensions over here so they all make sense. So there's some level of replication to the builder on what we have done. So I'm going to do some of these overalls. 4 foot 10 inches. That makes sense. So I'll go from that point to that point. Make sure it says 4 foot 10. It does. That's a critical dimension. The next one was what? From that location to the overall height. Okay, from that location to the overall height. Now, why has my overall height changed? Because this one had the shingles, and the shingles offset that height just a bit. Now it's 5 and 5/8. Great. So with this dimension, I'll select Dimension, Continue, and I'll go to the same point. So now this number, 14 and 3/8 equals that one. And when we go here, these numbers match up. The 14 foot and 3/8, 14 foot and 3/8, yep. The 410, yep, those all line up. So that's what the differences are. This 1 inch is slightly difficult to read, so let's move that one over. And I'll note that that's the offset distance from the base of the saddle support up. It has a 1 inch offset. That's just to allow for water clearing underneath it. My dimensions underneath here, there I have a 3 foot dimension for the overall width. 10, 1 foot 4, 10. Well, here I've got 10, 1 foot 4, 10. So those two dimensions verify. I'm using the same numbers. I'm not dimensioning post to post because I don't have it here. And everything else is the same. So there we have our drawing. We have our top view. We have our side view. We've got our detail view. And my next session, I'm going to be putting in all of the text information. So I've switched over to my text layer and I've copied and pasted some of the information that's relative here. This is what we really have to note through this drawing. The reference bubbles refer to the drawing itself. So 1L7 refers to the top plan view, and this is the view you should see on L1. So whatever you have on L1, remove it and replace it with this actual detailed drawing that shows the line work of the beams underneath the roof and then the roof as shown here. It doesn't have to have dimensions. It simply has to identify where this is. If you are going to include a dimension, the only ones you should include are the center of post to post, so the 8-foot dimension and the 12-foot dimension. This is my sectional reference, which refers to drawing 3L7, which is this one right here. I have some basic notes on the top view and the side view, and then corresponding notes with a bit more detail on the sectional view. So you can see through here, this is all the information we talked about on how we actually developed this. These two views that are a 1/4 inch each, this one on the right side is at a 1/2 inch. Now take a look at this reference that I've made to the section. Notice it's in here cutting through the thickest part of the beam. So I'm looking in that direction. This is accurate in terms of the information. Now, to be absolutely correct, this really needs to be down in this location in the reverse position. So I can do that. I'm going to copy this information, or sorry, I'm going to move this information here because I'm actually looking at, see if I look at it from this side, the fascia is on the right, but actually the fascia is on the left. So I want to move this, and I want to move it from this current location here, and I'll hold down Shift, and I want to move it here, and I want to flip this over, so I will also move this, and then move this one more time, so it's not interfering with any of the drawing information in that direction. And this clearly shows how the section is to be viewed. Now, you may see that this is slightly competing against one another. Can I put this anywhere else? Well, I'm going to leave it just the way it is. As long as that line goes through the ridge at the top, that's key, and this line goes through the ridge at the top, these two are fine. And that refers to what we're looking through very precisely. See, if I look through this way, the fascia board is at the bottom or to the left, and the beams to the right. The fascia board's to the bottom or the left, and the beams to the right. So this is now an accurate definition of the sectional view, what we're actually looking through in terms of the drawing and the content of it. So great, this is correct. All this information that I've got in here identifies the manufacturer of the asphalt shingles. We're just using plywood. The spacing of everything, the supported structure, whether it be 2x6, 2x8, the center spacing of the framing, fascia board, wood post, Simpson strong tie post saddle. I didn't identify the specific saddle number. Simpson strong tie has a huge catalog of different ones, but it talks about at least having an offset. If I leave it at this, then the builder can actually pick which Simpson strong tie saddle to use. It just has to have a 1-inch offset. If I actually specify the number of the Simpson strong tie, then they have to use that. So defining the information is very critical in terms of what gets purchased and what gets used. So what's different on this side? On this side, I talk in a bit more detail about what the elements are, the layers of the elements, the order that they're in, the drip edge, the ice and water shield. I talk about the post, the dimensions of the overhang, and all that kind of detailed stuff that really doesn't get seen on the plan view or the elevational view. Now, make note, on the elevational view, everything below grade is a hidden line. On the sectional view, everything below grade is a solid line. So this drawing is complete with all the information. Could we put more? Definitely, if we wanted to. I'd draw another page, but in this case, that's all that we need for this drawing. So I hope you understand how to lay out the project and understand the basis of drawing a gazebo. And this is something that you can then apply to pergolas, multiple-sided gazebos, anything of that nature, and it all works on the same principles.